So thank you very much for joining me on this session today. Ransomware is actually something that isn't new in many ways. It's something that has been around for a number of years. And so as I thought about this session, the first thing that struck me is, why are we talking about this now? What's really changed? And I think there are two key catalysts. The first catalyst is a lot of cybercrime has been about driving revenue in the last decade or so. And if you think about the reality, there has been so much financial fraud. The value of credit cards, of online banking information has significantly declined. And so criminals have now had to look for new ways to increase their revenue stream. And so unfortunately, ransomware is the modern replacement. Ransomware allows the cyber attacker to move from now where they would potentially generate $5, $10, $20 per banking information stolen to, on average now, we see about $1,000 as the average taken for just encrypting one person's hard disk. Now, what you can see behind you, and I'd encourage you to have a look at this, is just a short summary of ransomware through the years. And it started off very simple. I encrypt your data. But early versions was so simple that you could decrypt it yourself. Often the decryption key was actually stored within the content itself. But it was actually back just a few years ago, we saw the move to far more sophisticated encryption that really now started to kind of create this challenge. And that was 2013. And already then, whilst ransomware is still very much in its infancy, we've seen a very fast progression. We saw in 2015 SAMHSA take the idea of targeted attacks and pull that together with ransomware to now say, I will go after specific data in specific organizations, and there I can ransom them for a much greater amount. We saw in 2016 ransomware move from traditionally the Windows platform into the mobile platforms and into the Mac platforms. And actually, most recently here in the Kingdom, we've seen an interesting twist yet again, which is to ransom people not for money, but to actually encrypt their data and then use that to blackmail them to try and force them into delivering political messaging back into the kingdom. So I think the key point for me here is, whilst we may be used to the term, the capabilities of what it can do and what we expect it to do are still very much in their infancy and will grow. Now, I'm sure many of you are used to seeing this kind of diagram. This is the life cycle of the attack and the different methods that attackers go through. And in many ways, you look at ransomware and go, well, actually, it's not that different. It's still potentially about doing some reconnaissance if it's targeted. In many instances, it's not targeted, so they skip that. And then it's about reaching out to a system, launching some level of exploit or using exploit kits to gain access, and then remotely downloading the actual bit of code that then encrypts the data on your system. And once it's done that, talking back to the attacker so they can then hold you to ransom for it. And whilst a lot of that might seem exactly the same in what you're used to, there is one fundamental difference. In a traditional attack, when the attacker gets access to your system, that is just the start of the journey. Generally, it requires the human attacker then to connect in and start using stolen credentials to move around to gain access to your information. In ransomware, as soon as that attack code is downloaded and executed, your data is now encrypted. And so it changes the game for us from having a good amount of time in many ways and an acceptable level of maybe a few systems being compromised to literally the first moment that it happens, now you've lost access to your data. And so 1% compromised is 1% too much. And I want to just give you a quick example of this, because in many ways, ransomware kind of seems a really simple concept. I just encrypt your data and I force you to pay money to get it back. But I'll share with you some research that was done by the Cyber Threat Alliance, and that's a consortium of different security vendors working together, where they looked at CryptoWall. And over a 6-month period, we saw over $325 million of payment go through different Bitcoin wallets. That is a very significant revenue stream. You can see over 4,000 different variants of it, nearly 50 different campaigns. This was not just a simple attack. This was an organized group. And what I want to highlight to you is the underpinnings that sit behind such a simple concept. So how did it work? Well, just like any other bit of ransomware, it would either come to you as a targeted email, or if you went to the wrong website, then you would be compromised just by visiting it. How did the attackers do that? Well, they used an exploit kit called Nuclear to go out and find websites that were using WordPress, which is a very common tool for developing web pages, and then embed their code within there. So very often you'd go to a legitimate page. As soon as you go to that page, it would then launch exploits against you or point you to different websites, or often use hidden embedded advertising scripts to instigate the exploits to gain permissions that would again point you off to a different website to then actually drop down the latest version of the attack that would then encrypt your data and then hold you to ransom. So it sounds all pretty simple. But when you start to look at it, over just that 6-month period, this is the infrastructure that was behind CryptoWall. You see some pretty broad capability. If I look at some of the different campaigns there, and I apologize that this is so small you can't really see it, but this was the reality, you can see the different campaigns, the volume of architecture that the organized group put in behind this to give this resilience and sustainability. But the most important part of this for me is when we start to think about how do I deal with ransomware, actually whilst we saw variant after variant, campaign after campaign, the architecture that fundamentally allows this to succeed stays the same. And if we want to change the game, we have to look not just what happens to our systems, but how actually that occurs. Now, the bottom bit there is too small to see, but I thought I'd blow it up one more level. If you were to pay them the Bitcoin payments, this is some of the flow that it would go through. And we would see in some instances over 200 hops of that Bitcoin payment to try and obfuscate where it was going to. And in fact, what we could see is it was going very much into the kind of east corner of Europe. And interestingly, we see this a lot in ransomware. There was actually specific capabilities in here to make sure that it didn't attack any system within those kind of country ranges. So hopefully I've given you a bit of context. Let me give you the reality. And I'll start with just the global view, and then I'm going to make it very local. So what you can see here is a significant growth in the last 12 to 18 months of ransomware. And what, not unsurprisingly, you see behind this is a huge growth in the Bitcoin payments. And this is just what we've seen over that period. And you may ask, why is there that kind of spike? That first spike, I think, is really as we saw the first campaigns, and then as we start to respond, you see the defense kick in, and then you see the adversary start to adapt and build out their capabilities. How do they hit us? Well, most commonly, you can see there, all the ones highlighted in yellow are different email methods. It's about persuading us to click on something to go self-compromise, often to a trusted website. What are the different campaigns that are out there? Well, if I look just at some of the top ones, you'll see things like Locky, Cerber, and others that just keep going and going and going. And we're tracking over 100 different ransomware families just today alone. The final part of this, and I think this is probably the other reason why we've seen such growth in ransomware, is we move from something that was historically aimed at just the financial industry to something now that hits every industry. Because all of us have valuable data in different formats, and if we lose it, all of us are impacted by that. So the scale and scope has dramatically increased compared to traditional cybercrime. So let me now bring this very locally to the kingdom. What are we seeing in the kingdom? Well, what you see is a very similar spikes in the kingdom. We see different campaigns going at different times. Some of them are focused specifically on industries, such as the one we're tracking right now. Others are just more focused in what is the point of compromise, and if you happen to go to the wrong place or get the wrong email, then you'd be a victim. Again, you see email is the most predominant method of delivery. Really interesting one. I've seen this quite a lot recently. Probably one of the biggest victims of ransomware has been the healthcare industry. As more and more organizations build in what we would call the digital twin, using digital technology to enable whatever it is they do. In this instance, it might be healthcare records, x-rays or things, if you can't access those, then you can't actually perform whatever medical procedure you need to do. Now, I wanted to kind of highlight just what are the top ones we're seeing here, and a couple of things here. Locky and Cerber are the two kind of biggest families we see in here, but actually those other tags in between are the techniques used, and it kind of gives you a really good indicator. So delete volume snapshots is a sub-function we see in a lot of bits of ransomware, which, as you'd expect, is all about deleting data volumes, either off physical drives or remote drives or virtual drives. Invoke Windows shell command, Windows WinWord launch PowerShell, kind of highlights actually what we're seeing a lot of these, which is they're almost kind of old school low tech. Often they're coming in as things like Word documents and using that to launch shell commands to then just do basic execution of being able to pull things down from remote source and detonate them on your system. So whilst we live in an era of looking at kind of very sophisticated high-tech attacks, actually what you've got here is something that's using very low-tech, 10-year-old techniques in many instances. So let me kind of just give you a bit more detail on the two kind of key strains that we're seeing here locally in the kingdom. So Locky is part of the Dridex family. That's a much broader malware family. And what we see in many instances, again, they've built out a very broad platform architecture to deliver this on. Often they're using Nuclear, which is another exploit kit. There's a method of getting permissions to third-party systems to drop their code on there, and also to gain access to your systems and permissions. Specifically, this typically uses, as you saw there, things like WinWord as a delivery. Often they'll try and create documents that are socially engineered to a way of either trying to encourage the user to open them, or maybe something actually relevant to your business, and execute those shell commands, as I talked about. The one real damaging part of Locky for businesses is not only will it try and wipe data on your local drives, it will also look for any network resources, whether those are mapped or unmapped drives, and then try and encrypt the data on those as well. So the impact is much broader than just the local system. If I come on to Cerber really, to me, kind of highlights, I think, unfortunately, the real problem today. So Cerber is actually ransomware as a service. So what does that mean? The people that wrote Cerber actually offer out the ability to deploy it and to execute it to third parties. And they charge 40% of the profits as their commission. So this is now a service. They're hiding behind others to do it. It also specifically has the ability to target database formats and structures. For most of us, that's our most critical data. The other thing that makes this a real challenge is the actual encryption payload, the how it does its damage to you, cycles literally every few seconds on all of those download points. So if you're relying on traditional techniques such as AV signatures, you're never going to keep pace. You need to think of other ways of how you're going to spot something that literally was generated just a few seconds ago. So I've given you an insight into what and what's happening here locally. What I wanted to share with you finally was an insight into, so what do we do and what are others doing? This is just a poll we ran across the whole of the region to say, how important is this to you? And I think the simple summary is this is probably the most relevant generic problem every organization has to deal with. So what should we be doing about it? Well, simple preparation. Make sure you understand what is your important data. Make sure you back it up regularly. Understand what kind of shares you've got. How could such an attack jump across it? And the simplest bit, educate your users. Put them through anti-phishing training. Help them understand what happens when they click on things that they don't necessarily know where they've come from or what they are. Prevention. Make sure you have ongoing visibility as to where you focus, what's important to you, and how do you reduce that down to reduce your exposure. The last I'm going to come on to, which is what are some of the new detection techniques that are out there to help you with this. The final part for me in this, and kind of the generic things you can do, is plan for the worst. Think about if you were to be ransomed, how would you get that data back? What's the process you've got? How would you recognize that? Now, I thought I'd share with you what your peers are doing. And so, you know, the sad part of this is you can see that a few do pay the ransom, and I would encourage you not to. For many, actually, their traditional techniques didn't help them out of the problem. Backup and restoration has been our safeguard to this point. But I want to spend literally about 1 minute and just giving you a flavor into how can we deal with this problem in a different way, next generation endpoints. Well, the first method of getting this to you is through exploits, but there are more and more of these, so we have to have a different way of approaching that problem, not by each exploit, but by understanding the fundamental techniques that exploits use that gives us a much broader method of dealing with the problem. The next part is to kind of think about how do we build a broader level of defense. We've traditionally relied on something that says, help me discover this, and then let me validate if I've known about it before. But actually what we need is a layered approach that says, let me understand if I trust this file, let me understand what kind of activities this file does, and at every stage of that process be able to filter out the things that could look like ransomware or have been seen as ransomware. And so how do you do that? Well, there's two different techniques. Build these out. One is what we'd kind of call the traditional static analysis. Are these things in the bad that looks bad? Can I recognize this as being a bit of ransomware I've seen before? Well, that works with some of them, but not in things like Cerber. So actually with things like Cerber, where it changes every time, are there subcomponents within that file? Are there bits of capability that I recognize and have seen before? And how do I keep building and learning on that experience? And that's, you'll see more and more machine learning coming in. And then there's dynamic analysis. So it looks bad and I think it's bad. Let me send it up to somewhere to really do that cross-validation. Let me test it in different environments. Let me cross-validate the infrastructure that's using to see whether I can tell that because it came from this IP address and I recognize some code on that IP address or I recognize the communications, when I start to pull all those facets together, actually now I can see, even though I didn't know about this before, the broader architecture that it's functioning with gives me the strong indication of what it's doing. So I'm not kind of here to sell you on product, but give you a quick flavor on those techniques. What I would say is think about how do you link those techniques between your endpoint security, your network security, and everything else you use, because ransomware is all about stopping it before it happens. We can't wait for the 5 minutes, the 10 minutes, the few hours whilst we build it out. So with that, hopefully I've given you a really brief insight into the problem, and we've got, I think, about 3 or 4 minutes for some questions, if there are some.
Hello.
Hi there.
In case that I've got hacked and the ransomware is asking to the files, what should I do in that case?
So I think let me make sure I heard the question because we lost sound a bit. If you get attacked and they've encrypted your data and they're asking for money, what should you do? So the short answer to that is, number one for me is containment. So you need to identify which systems you believe have been ransomed and make sure they no longer have any network connectivity so this can't get any broader. Number two for me is then you need to think about what data is on those systems. Is that data that's important to you and do you have backups to it? You know, my hope would be that you have those backups and you can restore them. The one thing I would encourage you not to do is just go wipe those systems. I think there's always lessons that can be learned to go, so how did that actually get in? How can I do some forensics, whether it's looking at my network logs, whether it's looking at my endpoint security logs, to understand how did they get through this time so I make sure they didn't get through the next time. Should you give them the money? That's kind of a philosophical question, unfortunately. My view would always be no. But I think at the end of the day, that's a challenge that only you can decide. If you really can't get that data back, how much is that information worth to you? The one thing I would say is there is no guarantees that if you pay them, then you'll get it back. Now, what we generally do see is it's a business for them. In most instances, they will restore the data. But what we have seen is plenty of instances, in another hour, they'll re-encrypt the data again. Blackmail, unfortunately, isn't a fair game. That's a very good question. Thank you. There's another one way up the back there if we have time. If it's a short question.
I would like to ask about the next generation platform. Is that will be if it will affect the the utilization of the system of the servers in my environment? Because as I see that it's anomaly detection system. How's that will be affect in my environment?
So I think the easiest way to think of these is traditionally security products try and look for the whole threat. And that's where you see things like server where it's permanently changing, they struggle to keep up, or they look for the whole vulnerability. And then you're waiting for somebody to discover it so you can then write a signature or get the patch. Next generation techniques are almost kind of like the microscope that says, if I look at the attack, it's made up of hundreds of little subcomponents. So if I can recognize 30 of those subcomponents, even though I don't see the whole thing, now I really know it's still part of this family and I can deal with it. And the same in that vulnerability detection. If I would say, I can see you've got the flu, well, actually, I can look at the symptoms of what gives you the flu. And that vulnerability detection is that same way. We look for the symptoms that would lead to you being compromised. So it should have no impact on the stability, and in fact, less impact in terms of resource on your systems than traditional techniques. Just like everything, as science evolves, so do our capabilities evolve. As cyber threats evolved, so have our cyber security capabilities evolved. Thank you. Great question.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.